For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. This is the show that examines policies and developments through the intersection of politics and economics to share a fresh perspective with you every week, especially in trying to unpack the underlying strategic imperatives. I'm your host, Anil Padmanabhan. This week, we try to do things a bit differently. The context is the upcoming Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which is one of the most significant developments in the country. And given the leadership position that the Communist Party enjoys in that country, it has ramifications for the rest of the world, especially given the fact that China is the second largest economy in the world. So, to walk us through, we spoke to Richard Martin, who is a veteran observer of the region, and currently he's the chief of IMA Asia. And prior to this, he used to head the EIU's unit overseeing Southeast Asia. So the perfect person to begin this conversation with. Welcome to the show, Richard. Thank you for joining us. I will just jump in directly into the questions. So the latest World Economic Outlook projects that the world economy is going to slow down, and particularly China, which is going to slow down to about 3.3%. What are your first thoughts about this?
Well, it's a fascinating time to be watching China. I think the thing that's become clearest to us about China this year is it's not that interested in growth. It's not interested in the GDP number. You know, all of us thought it was going to aim for 5%. That's not its goal. Not its goal this year, probably not its goal ever in the future, at least under the leadership we've got. And so you think, what are they trying to do there? Well, a couple of things. China wants to be a successful Communist Party-led state. And that is really a dominant goal this year that they're paying attention to. You could say they've sacrificed growth to achieve that goal. A second thing is they want China to be a powerful national player, at least equal to the United States. So there's a big push on nationalism and try to force China's line on global politics, interpret things the way China sees it. And then a third thing it really wants to be is a technology leadership. And of course, that's leading into a pretty tough battle. At first, it was just with the United States, but it looks like it's going to be broader. So that's, I think, one of the big things we've learned about China this year. Growth, they're just not focused on that. They've got other goals. It's about what China wants to be.
So, Richard, this point you make that they are pivoting from a strategic shift away from growth towards more in an ideological plane. So what does it entail for the economy, this kind of a big pivot?
Well, the impact on the economy has been pretty clear this year. I mean, the ideology is right behind COVID-19. They want to prove that China knows how to handle a pandemic, not only how to control its population and deliver a good outcome, but of course, one of the things that's been a big problem, they want Chinese technology to lead their success in managing COVID-19. They want their vaccines to be proven world leaders, and that's a bit of a problem because they're not there. They're stumbling and trying to put together an mRNA vaccine. I think that's been one of the key issues on the ideology. Well, another one really is it's not really the China we thought we were going to be seeing. You know, they've turned away from that concept of when they joined the WTO back in 2001 of becoming a market-led economy. It's going back to being a party-led and a state-owned enterprise-led economy. And that's a pretty big shift.
So, Richard, that's a very, very big pivot, moving away from a market-oriented economy to one which is going to be state-led. So, do you really think China, I mean, when you look at it from outside, has the institutional capacity to carry out this kind of a massive pivot? Does it have the existing institutions to shepherd them through this change?
Well, interesting question. Now, when we think about institutions, the one that is dominant is the party. And under Xi Jinping, since he took over as party secretary in 2012, it has taken control of every organization in the country. The military, the civilian government, of course, all of the state-owned enterprises, all private enterprises, all schools, everything is now controlled firmly by the Communist Party. And it was interesting to watch COVID-19 because what happened during COVID-19 is it gave Xi Jinping and the Communist Party an opportunity to take firm control of households in a way that China hasn't had since the 1970s, because they just pushed in and said, okay, we can lock you in your household. And once we've locked you in your household, we can come in and unlock you, put you on a bus and take you away to a quarantine center. That type of hold over the individual and the household is there to stay. So when you talk about does China have the institutional structures to run the economy this way, it absolutely has. But the question is, what will it give up in running the economy this way? I think what they're going to give up is they're going to give up a higher growth path. It just may not be achievable to do this under an autocracy.
So, Richard, okay, let me do a quick follow-up. So this downside of slowing your economy deliberately to whatever sustainable levels that they think, given the new circumstance, will this stumble cost them because the Chinese economy has been built around rapid growth, and it kind of generates more growth, more employment. So if you suddenly slow down the machine, do you think it could lead to other consequences?
Of course, you've got to say, is it going to lead to domestic unrest and all of that? And the answer there is no. What it will do, when you think about the way politics works, is this is a tough time for companies and individuals. I know foreign firms complain about what's going on in China, but the people really hit by this are ordinary Chinese individuals, households, and corporates. Now, what's the political game book you follow when you run into tough times? Two things. You tend to blame outsiders, and they're doing a little bit of that, but you bang the nationalist drum as hard as you can to distract people from the difficulties they're going through. So I suspect that's what we're going to see in the next year. Now, that is going to be complex. Of course, it's difficult for all of the countries that deal with China. It sort of says, here's the China position in the global community. We want what we can take or what we can shape. And frankly, it's going to be difficult for foreign companies doing business in China. I think they can manage it, but boy, they're going to have to be careful about that.
Very interesting. So, Richard, just before we move away from growth, what is your medium-term projection for growth of China? This year, they're projecting 3.3. That's the IMF. But what is your sense? What is the range? Not the exact precise number.
Well, they're going to be lucky to get to 4% at any point in the next 3 or 4 years. Now, the key reason for that is right in the heart of the economy. About 25 to 30% of demand is a massive construction sector, which they're restructuring. And that's not fast or easy. And that restructuring will take 3 to 4 years. That's been about 50% of the headwind that they ran into this year. Of course, the other 50% was the lockdowns to do with COVID-19. We've thought a lot about this. You know, we've got a lot of clients in Shanghai. We've got some 220 clients in Shanghai. It's the biggest operation we run. We meet with them every week. We're sitting down talking about how do you work in that China market. And the problems with the lockdowns have been pervasive, particularly since the second quarter. Now, as we've watched this, and we've watched it right from the start of COVID, you know, I was up in China in February 2020 when this thing kicked off. As we think about it, we suspect they're going to move away from zero COVID policy and lockdowns at the end of spring next year. And the reason for that is look at every country that ran a zero COVID policy or a similar type of policy. So we've got a number of markets that did that. New Zealand did it very effectively. Vietnam did it very effectively. Taiwan did it very effectively. Now, New Zealand and Taiwan stopped doing it around about May, June this year. Until then, their deaths per million people were running at, 15 or 20 deaths per million people. But within 2 months of stopping, they jumped to 400 to 500. You simply apply that number to China and say, how many deaths will China get when it stops at zero COVID? It will easily get 500,000, if not close to 1 to 2 million. Politically untenable to do that this year. You'd multiply that number more if you do it in winter in China. So you've got to wait for spring, and then they know they have to get out then. So, if you're talking about growth in China, we think it picks up in Q2 of 2023, because that's when they come out of the zero COVID policy. But if you're talking about 4 to 5 years, then you've got to focus on the fact that they're restructuring the whole construction property sector. That's not a fast fix.
Richard, this construction sector, if you stretch it to look at the entire, what they call the property market, it's been one of the big arguments that they have deliberately slowed it down to pierce the bubble and allowed companies to default. So now the issue is that can this be managed as they think it can be managed? Because from whatever reports we read in the FT and New York Times, etc., there seems to be some pushback from people who are refusing to pay EMIs. So it becomes a kind of vicious circle. You don't pay, these guys become default more, so the property market sinks deeper. So do you think a fix is possible?
Look, every country has a property crisis. This is the first one in China, at least since the Second World War, and certainly in the certainly in the open door period since it kicked off in 1980 when Deng Xiaoping got it going. And certainly since the private ownership of property occurred, and that was at the tail end of the 90s and really got going with the first mortgages around about 2000. So from that time to where we are now, China has never seen property prices fall for a sustained period. I mean, beyond a year. They've never dropped. And if you look at it from 2000 to where we are now, property prices are up almost tenfold. So it's been a phenomenal run up in property prices. And that creates part of the wealth of the China market that all of our firms are interested in. Now, every country has a property crisis at some point. That was the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009 in the United States. It was the Asia financial crisis in 1997. China faces a crisis of that proportion. Now, we've always said it can get through it better than what we saw in 97 or 2008 because of these differences. It has enough control, right? The Communist Party runs everything. It runs the banks. It runs the property firms, whether they're state-owned or private-owned. It runs them. It runs the people who take out the mortgages and all of that. Everyone is controlled. So it controls the whole game. It has enough money. It's got enormous national savings, even in its foreign exchange reserves. And a lot of people say you don't use those in your domestic economy. Absolutely, you can use them in your domestic economy. China's already done that once before. And it seemed to have a good enough plan. Back in 2018, Xi Jinping said property is for living in, not for investing in. He was trying to turn this around. Where we are right now is the national government is not stepping in with a rescue plan. What it's worried about is what worries all governments when they step into a rescue of property sector. Issue of moral hazard. If property firms and construction companies made wrong decisions, they should wear it. They shouldn't get a bailout. So that's what all governments think until the point when they realize that the drop in their property sector could knock the stuffing out of their economy for 7 or 8 years. Now, I think we're at that point now. China's the Beijing government, the national government, has been leaving it to local government and the industry to sort this out. They don't have the resources. This thing is in free fall. I think before we get out of Q4, the quarter we're in now, they have to step in at the national government level with a rescue plan. They're the only one with a balance sheet big enough to do it. And if they don't do it, then we can write off growth in China next year.
So I just want to pick that downside risk that you flagged in your conclusion. Is that the ripple effect that till such time, let's assume the best, that they do succeed in stabilizing the property market, but there's a transition period involved. Do you think the ripple effects, given that it's a third of the entire GDP, will not knock the stuffing out of the rest of the economy in the transition period?
Unfortunately, it does. And and again, that's what we learn when we watch a property sector crisis, whether it was in the United States or Asia. It just multiplies through the economy. I'll give you an example of that. So China would love infrastructure spending to offset the collapse in housing. But the problem we've got with infrastructure spending, and 2/3 of that is done by local governments, is local governments fund themselves from selling land use rights for residential property development. And those sales have collapsed. Also, local governments are being hit with another cost they didn't have in their budgets, which is under zero COVID, this testing of every Chinese citizen every 48 hours or every 3 or 4 days is being paid for by local governments. They are bust. So when China says, okay, we can balance the slowdown in housing by lifting infrastructure spending, and it says to the local government, get out there, approve projects and spend money, and we've approved more bond issuance for you, local governments aren't able to do it. They just don't have the money. So a bit of a challenge there. The other ripple effect you get is look at consumer sentiment in China. The National Bureau of Statistics does a survey on this, their own statistics office. It crashed 3 or 4 months ago. I mean, since the index came out in 1990, it has never been as low. It has just gone through the floor. And that is because the average Chinese household has 60% of its wealth tied up in property. That's extraordinary overexposure to the property sector. So if the property sector goes, you write off the China economy. So the ripple effect is big, more like a tsunami effect, I think is what you're looking for here.
So Richard, just taking up from where you left off, is there a way out of this mess that it will take care that this ripple effect that you flagged does not go out of control?
Yes, there is. And again, there's no mystery to this because we've seen it happen in other property markets and financial systems around the world. What we've got to do is realize the bad debts in the system. And that's why you need a national balance sheet, the national government balance sheet to step in here. They have to, first, all of the banks that have lent for real estate have to indicate whether those loans are being paid back. And if they're not being paid back, they have to classify them as distressed or non-performing loans. Now, these will be loans to people who have bought property or to people who are construction and property firms. I think the big part of it are going to be loans to property and construction firms that have gone bad. Once we've identified the bad loans in the bank, then the government comes along, buys those bad loans out, and puts them into a bad asset management company. Now, China did that in the 1990s when a lot of its state-owned enterprises went belly up. So it's not new territory for them. They've got 4 giant asset management companies. One of the puzzling things about the crisis we've got in China now, and it sort of tells you the direction we've got to go, is China has a giant industry that deals in distressed assets. But those companies are not going to the local banks, which are the ones primarily, this is regional banks, provincial level banks, city level banks. They're not going to those banks to buy the bad assets because of two things. There's no national bailout plan on the horizon, and the price of property is continuing to slide. So you won't make money buying those bad assets. So as I said, there's no mystery about it. Once we can identify what the bad loans are, we get them out of the banks can go back to the business of lending, and then the managers of the bad assets trade them back into the market, for cents in the dollar and all of that. The problem we've got right now with the bank system, and they're in this problem right now, is they're unwilling to recognize the bad loans on their books. And they're in what we call a liquidity trap. They're being yelled at by Beijing, lend more money. But they're really nervous about lending more money because they suspect their books are bad. And at some point, they're going to have to recognize these bad loans. So they're sitting there. Their vaults are stuffed with money. They're just not in a position to lend it out. They're already in this mess. So the sooner Beijing gets in to sort this out, the better it is.
So Richard, is this, in your view, is this crisis that seems to be staring at China, the Chinese economy, is it the worst that has happened, or is it just one among a few?
So in the market economy period from 1980, this is the big one, because this is the one that can bring China to its knees, not just for 1 year, but it takes you 5 to 6 years to work your way out of that. China's only seen growth. And keep in mind, most Chinese citizens under the age of 40 have just lived in a country that has been transformed in front of them and done nothing but go up and up and up as their own wealth has gone up and up and up. So for everyone in China, this what happens now if they get this wrong is a rude shock. In fact, already there's a big shock for young and middle-aged people in China. They just are not used to seeing a government stumble like this. I guess that's been the other big surprise this year, not for economists and outsiders, but for ordinary Chinese. And I think in some of your communication with me before we got on this, you were alluding to this. For ordinary Chinese, to see a government that always managed things get it so badly wrong this year has been a problem. It's a shock.
So Richard, actually that brings me to a quick follow-up that in the past, whenever there has been a crisis, yes, not of this magnitude, the government has always stepped in and there has been a kind of some bailout, even as recently as the COVID or the 2008-2009 crisis. So what makes you believe that, do you believe that they can do it again, or this time it's a problem a little too big on hand?
We're hoping that after we get through the party congress in the middle of this month, October, that the government gets into gear. Now, the situation in the party congress is like this. There's no doubt Xi Jinping gets his third 5-year term. We've never doubted that, though many people have debated it. The bigger issue is a lot of people around him are going to change. And this is due to the age limits that they have for party members at different levels. If you're in the Central Committee, that group of some 200 plus men and women who are towards the top of the decision-making tree, I think it's 65 is the age limit, and you're out. And that's enforced every day around China. So people in the Central Committee are being rolled over already. Work your way up to the 25-member Politburo, and the age limit lifts a little bit up to 68. I think they say 8 down, 7 up. If you're 68 at the time the event is held next week, you're out of the Politburo. Now, 11 of those 25 members are going to be out, including a lot of people who had a key role in running the China economy. Liu He, who's the economic czar of the country, and of course, Premier Li Keqiang. Now, he remains premier until the state role moves next March, but he steps off the Politburo. So it's a bit like a company looking to its corporate headquarters at any time in the last few months and saying, wow, we know the CEO is going to be kept in mid-October, But we think the head of strategy, the head of marketing, the CFO, all those guys are gone. So no wonder they haven't been making many decisions in the last few months. So I think once we know who the new crowd is in the Politburo, and of course, then the key people on the the Politburo Standing Committee, that's 7 or 9 people, then I think they start to get into gear and start making decisions. And so one of those will be a national level bailout for the property sector.
So basically, you're seeing a new team, new hope, and we probably see a different narrative play out. But Mike, question to you is that at another level, is the Chinese economy, which is now the second largest economy in the world, is it too big to fail?
So big economies generally do a bit better than small economies when they're confronted with either external or internal risks. But China's role in the global economy is now critical. It's the world's biggest factory. So I know it's only, I think it's about an $18 trillion economy last year, up against 24 or 25 trillion for the United States. So the US is still much bigger. But China's manufacturing sector is 40% larger than the US manufacturing sector. It is gigantic. It makes so many things for everyone, consumer goods, capital goods, the whole lot. So if that big manufacturing engine stumbles, it'll reverberate around the world. Also, China demand for areas like commodities. If China stumbles, countries like Australia, with all of those iron ore exports, are really going to have a difficult time of it. So is it too big to fail? Yes, I think in a sense it is too big to fail. Look, there are a couple of things here. They do have the money in China. They do have enormous control over the economy. The real puzzle has been why they didn't get it together this year. Now, I think there's a reason for it. And we hear this from our forum members, who are the big Western multinationals in China. They're running factories across the China with billions of dollars of sales there. And they deal face-to-face with the local government officials and the party secretaries at the city and provincial level, primarily where their factories are. And one thing that was really striking, it started third quarter of last year, and it wasn't to do with COVID. It was to do with power rationing and meeting pollution guidelines. And party officials walked in and just ordered factories to shut, within 10 minutes of them walking in the door. It's pretty confronting. Now, our clients know these party officials. They've worked with them for 5 or 10 years or more. They're on good terms with them. But these people were scared. Senior level party officials at the provincial and the city level. And it got worse in Q2 of this year when they went into lockdown. And Beijing was telling party officials across the country to do 2 things. Zero tolerance for any COVID cases. That's zero COVID, so don't let that happen. But keep your economy running. And of course, those 2 are in direct conflict. So what they did and what they're doing today, if you read the news on China today, just last 24 hours, lockdowns again across Shanghai, they're not paying any attention to keeping the economy running. They're just locking people up in their buildings. So classic problem with an autocracy or a communist-run government where officials' entire future hangs on reading the wind from Beijing and following their line, and it really can lead to a snarl. So once we get out of the political period, new leadership team in, they can ease back on the political directions to these managers across the economy and get them to make a few more sensible decisions about keeping growth going.
So Richard, my final question to you that given all that we have discussed today, the one clear thing is growth is definitely going to slow down. And you also said it's not in the priority list of the regime at this point of time. So, and you also said it's a factory of the world. So it has huge reverberations for the entire world. But I'm more keen to know the regional impact that this is going to have when China starts slowing down at such a dramatic pace, particularly in Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific?
Well, there are two big things to watch, which really do affect the rest of the region. One is tourism. Outbound Chinese tourists were gigantic over the last decade and went from 0% of tourism inflow across Southeast Asia to 25 or 30%, and really drove Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, key in Singapore as well, a little bit down in Indonesia, even important for Taiwan and Japan and Korea. That is not going to restart next year. So that's a loss for everyone. And the reason it won't restart is they don't have mRNA vaccines, point one. Point two, Omicron and all of its variants are now endemic around the world and are going to be washing around the global population for the next 3 or 4 years. Now, most of us are fine. We've had it and we've got mRNA shots. But when you come from China, you've not had COVID. You don't have a good mRNA shot. So is Beijing going to allow its tourists to go offshore and then come home with COVID? Absolutely not. And so that massive, and we're talking about $500 billion that would flow out every year up until 2019. The second thing is a bit more positive for the rest of the region. We are seeing export operations relocating, not all of them, but some of them where they can, relocating out of China. You can actually see it in the statistics. Go look at US import statistics. China's share hit a peak, 22% of US imports 4 or 5 years ago. Now I think it's down to about 18% and steadily falling. The big winners so far have been Mexico and Vietnam. I think more will go down into Southeast Asia. Malaysia will get some. Thailand will get some. Interesting to see India is a big mover in this regard. And that's also been one of the big changes in the last 6 months. And you could say representative of that was the whole Apple iPhone 14 announcement, that not only were they intending to build that phone in India, but they were actually doing it. I think one of their subcontractors is already up and running, producing it. And Apple's bet had always been through Foxconn into China, and now it's rejigging its supply chain. Everyone is doing that now. So that's just those two things. They're big enough, the tourism and the restructuring of supply chains.
Okay. Thank you so much, Richard. You summed it up very well. I think we are looking at a very cautious phase of the Chinese economy, and by sheer size, it also means that it's a big note of caution for the rest of the world. Keep our fingers crossed, and let's hope the CCP generates the right momentum to generate the right decisions. Thank you again for doing this with us.
Thank you, Anil. Good to see you.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNewsGlobal on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And do share your feedback and insights with us. You can reach me on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.